Did the computer turn straight back on? I can't hear you, sorry. Could you come to the door? What's up?
It's already back on the live stream, and yes, it did.
Their live stream's on. Okay, cool. We are live on the internet having discussions about whether or not to leave. Okay, so sorry to everyone online. The computer's really playing up at the moment. Did this last time as well. So we're going to look in this part at man's idea of how everything came to be, what the origin of life on the planet was, and Yehovah's idea. Yehovah is very explicit in what he says. And we have from the scriptures, we have a story of how things came to be. And as people of faith, of course, we believe that story. What we have on the other side, what we have from man's perspective, is a story of how things came to be. And it's interesting, as we believe these things by faith, they believe those things by faith as well. They can look at things in the world and they can say, well, it makes sense that things came to be in that way. That story makes sense to me. But they still have to accept it by faith, because there's no way to test those things scientifically as to whether or not things actually came to be in that way. And just as we saw in the first part, that the light is understood by those in the light, the darkness did not understand the light. So the light understand when they hear the word of Elohim, the faith comes by hearing. They understand those things and they believe them as coming from Elohim. However, those in the darkness did not understand the light, the word, when it was given to them, and they have their own beliefs which have to be taken by faith. So this is what the scriptures say about where life on earth came from. They say, and Elohim said, let the waters teem with shoals of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth on the face of the firmament of the heavens. And Elohim created great sea creatures, and every living creature that moves with which the waters teemed, according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. And Elohim saw or understood that it was good. And Elohim blessed them, saying, bear fruit and increase, and fill the waters in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth. And there came to be evening, and there came to be morning, the fifth day. We're going to see that these things are things which are brought forth by the heavens and by the earth. We're going to see that at the beginning of the third part. Elohim said, let the earth bring forth the living creature according to its kind, livestock and creeping creatures and beasts of the earth according to its kind. And it came to be so. And Elohim made the beasts of the earth according to its kind, livestock according to its kind, and all the creep on the earth according to its kind. And Elohim saw that it was good. So according to the scriptures, everything was brought forth according to its kind. Okay, so if you like, dogs were dogs, things of the dog variety were of that variety, they were of that kind. What evolution says is that things weren't brought forth according to their kind. It says that kinds came forth from one original kind, one original form of life, one kind resulted in the diversity of kinds that we see on the earth as it is now. The scriptures say that's not how it is. You've got the kinds that came to be, and then you've got variety within those kinds, but everything started from animals of that particular kind. So here we see evolution's explanation of things. Okay, we've got right at the beginning, the sun ignites. You've got all of the gases gathering together, and then the mass of all the gases causes them to implode in on themselves, and then the stars ignite. That's how science says that the stars came to be, our sun. That's how that came to be. And then you have the very next thing, it says here, you've got cells without nuclei. Okay, so cells all have these, what's called the nucleus, which is like the brain of the cell. What they're saying is the very first cells didn't have this nucleus. And you've got photosynthesis coming to be. The very next thing after the earth, you've got these cells without nuclei. Then you've got photosynthesis, which is an incredibly complicated system to just have started. But this is their explanation. It's a very simplified form of their explanation, but this is basically what they're saying must be accepted in order for us to then start working from where we are today. Before we can start explaining, the human body, all the things the human body does, and have actual useful science, what we need to accept before that is that everything came to be through random accidents. Okay, you have these random mutations, and then because death kills things which are not beneficial, all that you have that survive are things with good random accidents that have happened to them. And once you've got rid of all of the bad stuff, all you have left is the stuff which has been benefited by random mutations which were beneficial. And now you've got us. And where we came from basically was all of our bad ancestors were killed off because they didn't have the right random mutations for us to exist today. So in their worldview, we have evolution, which uses death over millions of years to bring us to a better place. Have life, has something which is beneficial to it, an accident which caused something beneficial. It was so beneficial that it was the only form of that life form which existed from that point onwards. All the other ones, they didn't have whatever mutation it was, so they all died. And all that you have left are the ones that had the right mutations. Then over time, that leads you to the conglomeration of accidents which we are today. Then you have the Bible's record of events, which says that things were created, and then through man's actions, through sin, that brought death into the creation. And the two are not compatible, regardless of the fact that you will find people who say that God used evolution to create. He used that process which he had created to create man. The scriptures are opposite to that. They say, for this reason, even as through one man sin did enter the world, death entered into the world through sin. So you didn't have loads of death, which caused man to come to be. You had man, which caused loads of death to come to be. Death entered into the creation because of man, not man entered into the creation because of death. And what we see is a collection of anecdotes. Okay, evolution is a collection of anecdotes because there is no way to test evolution scientifically. Okay, the scientific method is useless when it comes to saying whether or not evolution is correct. I've spoken before about laws and theories within science. A law is just something that you see. Okay, it's the action that you see happening. It's the thing that you can observe. If this happens, then that happens. That's a law. Okay, that is, as far as we can observe, the way that things happen. What a theory is an explanation for that law. So you've got gravity, which is the law of gravity, which is basically when you drop something, it falls to the earth. It's more complex than that, but that's basically it. What the theory of gravity is then a scientific theory which explains why that law happens. So that's the difference between the law of gravity and the theory of gravity. Okay, with the theory of evolution, what we have is an explanation for how life came to be. We can observe life on the planet. We have a theory which explains where it came from. The theory of evolution is a collection of anecdotes which cannot be tested. What scientists like to do is they take a theory and explanation and they say, if that theory is true, then this will happen. That's called the hypothesis. Okay? Hypothesis is an explanation that you test in an experiment. We can't test where animals came from. Okay? So we cannot test the theory of evolution. The best that we can do with it is to form hypotheses and to test them. But nobody can ever test the anecdotes of evolution. The basic anecdote that is pictured here is that the reason giraffes ended up with long necks is because they needed to reach foliage that was higher up on a tree. Okay, so the animals with the longer necks were the only ones to survive in the line of giraffes. The ones with shorter necks, they couldn't eat the things that were higher up, and so they died. They didn't have enough food, and they all died off. And that is a reasonable sounding explanation, but it's not what constitutes science. No serious scientist would ever proffer an explanation like that to you and say that it had been scientifically proven. You don't get that in the realm of physics, for example. No one just comes up with a hypothesis. No one comes up with a theory and says that that's just the way that it is. We can't test that, but that's just the way that it is. Okay? In the field of physics, in fact, Ashley told me that her professors would say things like, when they were given a question about what happens when a photon goes through a slit. Okay, if we have the turning into a wave and going through both slits at once, what is actually happening there? And the serious scientists would say, we can't answer that. That's not something that we can test scientifically. So what you're talking about is not science. Okay, it's philosophy. And the same is true in the realm of biology, only it seems that among certain biologists, there's not that sort of honesty there. They will tell you that it is science to offer an explanation for something and to not be able to test it. Same's true of where man came from. You know, man had a bigger brain, and so all the things with bigger brains were better at doing the complicated tasks that we need to do to live. So the apes weren't as successful, or the things from which we descended were not as successful. The humans became the most successful form of that form of life. People will ask, why are there still apes on the earth if we evolved from apes? That's not a question that we should ask. Okay, that's not what those people are saying. Apes, those people are saying, are the most evolved form of the branch which became apes. Just as humans are the most advanced form of the thing which became humans. So none of them are actually saying we evolved from apes. They're saying that we evolved from something which branched off into apes and branched off into humans. That's a misrepresentation that you'll encounter. But the basic of that story, the idea that we came from something less complicated and we had bigger brains, or we had whatever the anecdotes are, and again it's a collection of anecdotes that led us to be more successful. That's what has caused us to be the human beings that we are now. Something which kind of disproves this, okay, which throws serious doubt on it, is something which is called irreducible complexity. That's when you've got something that is so insanely complex and has to be exactly in the form that it's in order to be successful, that you can't take out any individual component of that and say that it evolves slowly over time. You either have to have the whole thing working exactly as it works at that particular point in time, or none of it would work. Example with the bird's wing. One of the things that's necessary for birds to be able to fly is that their bones are hollow. If you just had an evolutionary chain of things which had more and more hollow bones, they wouldn't be successful. Okay, you'd have more broken bones in whatever form of life that was, and that form of life would never get off the ground, so to speak. You need all of these things to be in place. You need feathers to be designed exactly as they are in order for flight to be achieved. Okay, if you take out part of a bird's wing, none of it works. So the idea that we've got there over increments of improvement doesn't work in these fields. Okay, if you look on Google for examples of irreducible complexity, you'll see that there are many such examples of forms within nature that are only successful in that form because that entire form has come to be. You would never get there through little increments. The genetic code is like that, okay? You take this as an analogy of our genetic code in terms of how much information there is there. Okay, our DNA sequence, our genetic code, works in the way that it does because it tells our bodies how to produce proteins. And then our bodies fold up the proteins and they put them together in a certain way. And then that is a useful form. You cannot have DNA coming to be slowly in various parts because you need to have all of the genetic code present in order for part of the genetic code to be useful. Our genotype is our entire genetic code. Okay, we need all of the genetic code to be there before parts of it can be useful. What evolutionists do is they look at natural selection, and they say that natural selection, selecting things which are beneficial, is sufficient to tell us where life came from as a whole. Your phenotype is how your genetic code expresses itself. These are the things upon which natural selection can act. Okay, so if you've got a particular physical characteristic, that's your phenotype. Your phenotype comes to be because it is selected from your entire genetic code. Your genetic code tells you how to have long bushy hair as well as very thin, very sparse hair. All of the information is contained within that. Perhaps one phenotype is good in a certain environment. So in that environment, people with a certain phenotype are selected by natural selection to go forward and to be the most successful people. But that mechanism of natural selection is not sufficient to explain where the information which gives rise to all of the various phenotypes comes from. Okay, so the problem that we're looking at, put very simply, is we've got a huge complex genetic structure, our DNA, that tells us how we can get all of the things that would be naturally selected for. The problem is the explanation that we have for how the genetic code itself came to be relies on the mechanism which can only act once it has already come to be. This is not something which has escaped scientists who are looking into the DNA code, and in fact it didn't escape the scientist who was the person who discovered the DNA code. He wrestled with this idea of how could evolution be sufficient to explain where these things had come from, and he suggested several different things. It's like if you've got the instructions on how to make something, okay, it's like me saying, you can look at this manifold and you can improve this manifold. You can make it work better. And then me saying that that process of how you would improve the manifold is sufficient to explain where the actual instructions for the whole car came from. It's not a sufficient mechanism for that. That mechanism can only improve bits of the instructions. So this is a Wikipedia article by about a guy called Francis Crick, who was the guy who discovered DNA. Okay, it says, during the 1960s, Crick became concerned with the origins of the genetic code. In 1966, Crick took the place of Leslie Orgel at a meeting where Orgel was to talk about the origin of life. Crick speculated about possible stages by which an initially simple code with a few amino acid types might have evolved into the more complex code used by existing organisms. He wasn't aware of certain types of enzymes, certain complexity that was present in the DNA structure. So what he did is he came up with an explanation which was sufficient to explain his limited understanding. Very much the same as what Charles Darwin did. Okay, when Charles Darwin gave us the origin of species as an explanation, it was sufficient at that time to explain the very simple level of things that they understood. But now, as we've begun to appreciate that things are much more complex, Darwin's theory of evolution does not explain that. It was the same with Crick when he was trying to explain how DNA might have come to be with a few amino acids. Now we understand that even to get those amino acids would be impossibly difficult. So his explanation was not sufficient. It says, at that time, everyone thought of proteins as the only kind of enzymes, and ribozymes had not yet been found. Many molecular biologists were puzzled by the problem of the origin of a protein replicating system that is as complex as that which exists in organisms currently inhabiting Earth. In the early 1970s, Crick and Orgel further speculated about the possibility that the production of living systems from molecules may have been a very rare event in the universe, but once it had been developed, it could be spread by intelligent life forms using space travel technology, a process that they called directed panspermia. So this is the guy who discovered DNA, and he said what could give a rise to DNA, one explanation that he had wasn't sufficient to do it. He later said, well, this could have happened as kind of like this miracle event by an intelligent form of life, and then that event had been spread throughout the rest of the universe, and then you could have evolution take over, if you like, and cause different forms of life to come to be on other planets. The point that I'm making is the person who discovered DNA recognized what a problem it was, and his solution for it was that another intelligent life form had come up with DNA and then had spread it around the galaxy. That's something that made sense to him because he understood just how complex DNA is. Our understanding now of microbiology shows us just how many more times advanced than even Francis Crick's understanding of DNA is, how much more of a problem it is, how much weightier it is of a problem. It says, in a retrospective article, Crick and Orgel noted that they had been overly pessimistic about the chances of abiogenesis on Earth when they had assumed some kind of self-replicating protein system was the molecular origin of life. Okay, so later on they said, well, maybe this self-replicating system wasn't necessary right at the beginning. But again, this is all anecdotes. These are these people reaching and grasping for explanations because they realize how great the problem is. It's important that we understand that retrospectively they started to try and say, oh, well, maybe it didn't have to be spread by aliens because maybe you didn't need to have that complex a system in the beginning. It's important that we represent these people correctly. You'll often hear things about Charles Darwin. Like, actually, Charles Darwin once said to somebody that God must have been necessary for the entire process of evolution to start, or, you know, this, that, and the other. You hear many misrepresentations about these people. You know, you could just say, Francis Crick, the originator of DNA, discoverer of DNA, he thought that it had to be alien life forms that moved these things around the galaxy. You could say that as an isolated quote and it would be correct, but it lacks the correct context. So it's important for me to explain the correct context of these things. This is in life itself. Francis Crick said, an honest man armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense, the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have had to be satisfied to get it going. But this should not be taken to imply that there are good reasons to believe that it could not have started on the earth by a perfectly reasonable sequence of fairly ordinary chemical reactions. The plain fact is that the time available was too long, the many microenvironments on the Earth's surface too diverse, the various chemical possibilities too numerous, and our own knowledge and imagination too feeble to allow us to be able to unravel exactly how it might or might not have happened such a long time ago, especially as we have no experimental evidence from that era to check our ideas against. So essentially, what he does at this point is he says, listen, I'm not saying that it had to be spread by aliens, and I'm not saying that something so impossible couldn't have come into being somehow. I just don't know how that idea is. And even if I had an idea how that idea is, it's useless because we couldn't test it by experiment anyway. That seems like somewhat of a cop-out to me. It's important that I show to you that he didn't just say, oh, it had to be aliens. Okay? Actually, I think the idea that he came up with in the end was all the more ridiculous. It seems like it would be impossible. It seems like it would be a miracle for this to come to be. But I think the period of time that we're talking about is so long that it had to have happened during that period of time. And it's just because we're so feeble-minded as humans that we can't work out how that would be. And even if we could work it out, we'd never be able to test it. So really, it doesn't matter. Let's just ignore that particular problem. I think this is more ridiculous. He did say biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Okay? To me, this is the problem that he's dealing with when he's trying to explain these things. He couldn't just say, this is ridiculous. This is a system of such complexity that it couldn't have come about any other way than it was designed. We don't see anything on the earth which was not designed, which is anywhere near this level of complexity. He says as his thesis, his foundational idea, he says, we have to keep in mind that it wasn't designed, it was evolved. And then from that point, he said, well, maybe it could have been aliens, or maybe it's just that we're too stupid, and we can't test the ideas anyway, so let's not worry about it. Okay, in one of his lectures on the genetic code, he said, finally, one should add that in spite of the great complexity of protein synthesis and in spite of the considerable technical difficulties in synthesizing polynucleotides with defined sequences, it's not unreasonable to hope that all these points will be clarified in the near future and that the genetic code will be completely established on a sound experimental basis within a few years. Okay, so basically what he's saying is, this problem seems incredibly difficult. We can't give you an answer, but it's not entirely unreasonable that maybe someone will just pluck an answer out of thin air, or they'll think about it and come up with an answer in the course of time. So this is the guy who discovered DNA. He understood it. He understood that it was a huge problem. Certainly a huge problem for the theory of evolution. Now, I want you to see this. It speaks of Crick. When he talks of Crick at the beginning, it is this Francis Crick. This will explain to you somewhat of the magnitude of the problem that they're facing.